Malcolm. That's great. This is an amazing story of Agent Garbo, who is the most successful double agent of the Second World War. He was a Spaniard and his name was Juan Pujol. He was a double agent because the Germans saw him as their star spy in England, providing them with the best information they could possibly get. In fact, he was working for MI5 and sending misleading information. The Camden connection is that Thomas Harris, his MI5 handler, was born in West Hampstead. We found this out when Marianne Collins and I were researching our two books, books that Malcolm has just mentioned. We're doing those for the Society, and they're going to be called The Streets and Characters of Kilburn and West Hampstead. We hope the first one, which will be north of the Jubilee line, will come out later this year. And if we can get through the process, we might even get the second one out towards the end, but more likely early next year. But they've been completely redone. We've worked for about 4 years researching these. And as I say, this particular story just came out. And the more I looked into it, the more interested I got. So let's start the slides. Here's Thomas Harris. He's an art dealer. He's smiling, and Juan Pujol, who's Agent Garbo, said he was always smiling. And this is a nice picture of him. He's the MI5 handler of Agent Garbo. So as we go through, you'll pick up some more information. This is an Ordnance Survey map of the 1950s. Now, to give you some idea where we are on this, we've got West End Lane on the left-hand side, and Finchley Road would be up on the right. And Lymington Road is a road that runs off West End Lane. You can see where the red house is. That's the house where he was born, number 21 Lymington Road. It's on the corner with Crediton Hill, which is where all our actors live at the moment. And if you continue that road up, you'll see the tennis courts, which of course are still there, and Hampstead Cricket Club is also still there. But most of the rest of it, particularly the areas down the bottom of the picture, the Cadbury Fry and the Canada building, they are all now under the O2 car park, which of course is currently being thought about a major development there. But this is the 1950s map. So he's born there in 1908. A piece of trivia, Sid James, the comedian, actually lived in the same house from 54 to 56. The house, of course, has now been demolished, and it's now a modern block of flats. But that was our connection. We started there. We're going to travel much broader than the Camden area. We're going to go all over the place. This is their next house. This is a really beautiful house, 6 Chesterfield Gardens in Mayfair. What happens is Tommy's father, Lionel, was an art dealer, and they did very well. They set up the Spanish Art Gallery in London, and Lionel had married a Spanish woman. So Tommy spoke fluent Spanish. And when he's a good artist. So when he's aged 15, he wins a scholarship to study at the Slade. And he later opens his own art gallery and then joins his father, selling works by Goya, Velázquez, and other Spanish artists. They were very successful, and as I say, got this really beautiful house. When Lionel died in 1943, Thomas inherited the Spanish gallery and also this house. And the house was kind of open house for the younger officers of MI5 and MI6. Just let's clarify, MI5 is basically the home-based intelligence side, and MI6 is the foreign side. But in this story, they kind of overlap, as you'll see as we go through. Both MI5 and MI6 are involved in this story. Just to give you some idea of the people who would come to the very many parties that were held at this house, Tommy was friends with the Cambridge group of Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, and Kim Philby. So there's a few names you ought to have recognized there. They're regular visitors to Chesterfield Gardens. As far as we know, he didn't know they were Russian agents at the time. but there are all sorts of rumors that he might have been working for the Russians as well, but there's absolutely no evidence to prove that. Now let's look at Juan Pujol. This is our Spanish guy. Here's a lovely picture of him when he's very young, somewhere in the 1930s. He's got a military uniform on. The Spanish Civil War begins in July 1936 and ends on the 1st of April 1939. Bizarrely, Pujol served on both sides in the Spanish Civil War, and later he proudly said, "I'd not fired a shot for either side." He was very proud for not firing a shot on either side. He hated the extremism of both the left and the right, and he really was very unhappy. He tries his hand at business, farming. He runs a chicken farm, he runs a cinema, he does all sorts of business ventures after the war, but he fails in all of them. He's a terrible businessman. What he is a dreamer. He's an amazing creative mind, and you'll see that's the important thing when he starts working as a spy. Just as the Spanish War finishes, he meets Araceli, who is here. This is, they're very happy at this point. They're very much in love in 1939. There's another picture of them, slightly more detail. This is from their passport photos. This is a bit later. As World War II develops, Juan decided he must do something. So in 1941, he goes to the British Embassy in Madrid to offer his services as a spy. They give him the runaround. They really are not interested. He's sent from room to room to room and then politely shown the door. They can't see how he can be useful. What he then does is really strange. He decides he's going to infiltrate the Germans. So he goes to the German embassy in Madrid and convinces them by masquerading as a fascist who's really willing to work for the Nazis, which he wasn't. It's completely made up. But they were taken in, they did their vetting, not particularly accurately vetting, and they train him in the basic elements of spycraft, such as secret writing. It's very basic, he gets a few secret writing equipment. They give him a bit of money, they send him to Lisbon and say, "Go to England and spy for us." So he heads off to Lisbon. There he's stuck, he can't get a visa. He cannot get a visa to travel to England. And what he decides to do is quite incredible. He decides to pretend that he's gone to England, and he starts sending messages to the Germans in Madrid, completely made up. The whole thing is completely fabricated. He goes to the cinemas, he watches newsreels, he gets reference books out of the Lisbon library, and he uses a guidebook, a Baedeker, about England. But then in April 42, one of his fictitious agents, supposedly working in Liverpool, sends information that there's a convoy about to leave Liverpool to go to Malta. So Pujol sends this information to his German handler in Madrid, and the Germans believe it, and they send a large number of U-boats and aircraft to attack the non-existent convoy. It doesn't exist. British intelligence pick up the coded messages, and Special Branch carries out a thorough search in vain, looking for a German agent in Britain. So they're very confused. Then Araceli, who at this point is playing a really important role, she goes to the American embassy in Lisbon and explains what Pujol was doing. She tells them that her husband is a spy working against the Germans. They inform the British, and this explains the mysterious messages from the elusive spy. So MI6 and MI5 are very impressed with his ability to fool the Germans, and they decide they have to get him to England. So he travels to Gibraltar on his own, and then the British put him on a flying boat and send him to Plymouth. And he arrives in Plymouth on the 24th of April, 1942. On arrival, he's interviewed by Cyril Mills and Thomas Harris, who acts as an interpreter because Pujol speaks very little English, and Cyril Mills speaks no Spanish. Cyril is an interesting character. He's working for MI5, but he's the son of the circus owner, Bertram Mills. Possibly, if we were old enough, to remember going to Bertram Mills Circus. In fact, it was run by Cyril after his father resigned. But he's also a very good MI5 officer. And he's, as I say, involved in the early part of interviewing Garbo. Well, he's not even called Garbo. Bizarrely, when he left Gibraltar, he's given the code name Bovril, which is a very strange, odd name. So he was Agent Bovril for a little bit of time. But what happens is Cyril and his wife go to the cinema and they see a film called The Two-Faced Woman, starring Greta Garbo. And when he comes back to talk to Tommy Harris, he says, I think Pujol is a brilliant actor. We'll call him Agent Garbo. And that's really interesting because if the Germans ever pick it up, they'll think they're looking for a woman. So that's how he gets his name, from this film. This is Greta Garbo in 1941, The Two-Faced Woman. Now, after a lengthy vetting process, MI5 are convinced that Pujol is genuine. This is obviously very difficult if you think about it, because he could have been planted by the Germans to get information and infiltrate and feed it back to them. But they think he's genuine. They're convinced he's genuine, and they set him up in a rented safe house in Hendon. This is bizarrely, this ordinary little house is 35 Crespigny Road. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. I think it's a French pronunciation. And it's very near Hendon Central. So if you can imagine Hendon Central, this is about a 5-minute walk away from the tube station. And as you can see, it's a very ordinary house, but it now has a blue plaque saying that Juan Pujol Garcia, which is his full name, worked there. So what happens at this place is after about 6 weeks, Araceli and their son arrive. She's got a baby son, and she's also pregnant with a second son. They're given an MI5 housekeeper and a nanny, but the vivacious and intelligent Araceli soon becomes bored with having to stay in, and she desperately misses her family in Spain. Meanwhile, Tommy starts working with Pujol, and Tommy rents a small office in Jermyn Street. And to give you some idea, that in the middle of the picture there, that's the Piccadilly Arcade. So he had a room above, just an ordinary tiny little office with a table and chairs, and I think one other room. He and Tommy takes over from Cyril Mills, because obviously Cyril doesn't speak Spanish, and Tommy and Pujol work for about 14 hours a day in this little office, supported by an assistant, Sarah Bishop. And Garbo's cover story for the Germans is that he's working as a translator for the BBC. Incredibly, we do have one of the surviving group. This is from a Time Watch program. This is Sarah Bishop, their assistant, speaking in 1999. This is on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube, you should be able to find the Time Watch program about the spies that fooled Hitler. And she said she's not on it for very long, but she's quite an important part. Tommy chose her because she speaks Spanish as well. So if you think about it, he's speaking Spanish, she's speaking Spanish. She makes detailed files for all the fictitious agents that Garbo and Harris create. These can contain their biographic information, all the messages they're supposed to have sent, and all sorts of details. For example, they have a spy, the one I talked about in Liverpool, they name him William Gerbers, and at some point they kill him off. They actually wipe him out, he dies in Liverpool, and they place his obituary in the Liverpool Daily Post, and they send a copy of his obituary to the Germans in Madrid. And in fact, the Germans are totally taken in. They send a pension to his wife, the widow, who becomes a cipher clerk, apparently, for Garbo. Now, to give you some idea of how complex this network they set up, you're not going to be able to see the detail on this, but this is astonishing. They create all these subagents. They're all invented. They're absolutely made up. So there's Garbo in the middle, and each of these lines coming out are supposedly agents who are sending information to Garbo. It's quite incredible. And they even invent down the bottom right-hand corner, that's a group of Welsh people. What happened is Garbo says, I've heard about these Welsh people who don't like the English. Welsh nationalists, are they? So they decide to create a group of fascist Welsh nationalists who are called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order. Isn't that wonderful? The Brothers of the Aryan World Order, and they're all Welsh in Swansea. And they tell the Germans, and the Germans are very pleased that Garbo's recruited all these fascists in Wales. Now, this is the point. Garbo is incredibly good at giving the Germans what they want to hear. That's his success. He just seems to know what they're interested in and gives it to them. So in the beginning, the messages are sent to Garbo's German controller in Madrid, who encrypts them using an Enigma machine, and they're then broadcast to Berlin. So what happens is Bletchley Park is able to pick up these messages and decode them. So they're actually reading the messages that the Germans in Madrid are sending to Berlin. In the beginning, Garbo uses invisible ink written between the lines of ordinary letters. And they're taken by diplomatic bag to Lisbon and then on to Madrid. But then in March 1943, they get a radio transmitter installed in Crespigny Road, and they have an operator from MI5 called Charlie Harris, and they use real but low-level information, which they call chicken feed, and that's provided for Garbo to send to the Germans. So he's actually sent them at this point real but very low-level information to convince them that he's actually a very good spy. To give you some idea, in the 3 years that Harris and Garbo work together, they're brilliant. They absolutely form a wonderful working relationship. They sent the Germans 315 letters and 1,200 radio messages. So it's a huge amount of information. I'm not going to go into detail about what that all was. So everything's going swimmingly at this point. And then a problem arises. Here's the very glamorous Araceli. She hated London. It's cold, it's wet. She desperately wants to go back to Spain. She's depressed, she's stuck in the house. She's got nothing to do except look after the 2 children, the 2 boys. So Tommy asks his wife, Hilda, to take her out on shopping trips, but that doesn't really solve the problem. Araceli has fits of homesickness and a desire for a more active and adventurous life. She's a very vivacious and social person, and they've just basically locked her up in this little house in Hendon with nothing to do. Everything goes to a point in June 1943. She and Juan have a huge argument. It's about going to meet a group of Spanish people from the embassy at a dinner party. Juan thought it's much too dangerous. He doesn't want to go. Araceli is furious. It's the one chance she has to meet Spanish people in London. She threatens Harris that she's going to go to the Spanish embassy and tell them all about what Garbo's doing, unless Harris gives her papers the next day so that she can go home to Spain. This is a really crucial moment. The whole thing could be absolutely destroyed at this point if she goes ahead and tells the Spanish embassy that Garbo is not really a German spy, but he's working for the British. Garbo comes up with a really drastic plan. He arranges with Harris to have him arrested because of Araceli's actions, and he sends her a note saying this is what's happened. She phones Charlie Haynes, the radio operator, and asks him to come to the house. And when he gets there, Araceli's sitting in the kitchen with the gas taps turned on, threatening suicide. Charlie phones Harris, who believes that Araceli is play acting. He doesn't think she's doing it for real. Now we go to the next part of Garbo's plan. Araceli is taken blindfolded to Camp 020, and he's brought in unshaven, wearing a prisoner's uniform. Now, this is where the meeting takes place. This is Latchmere House on Ham Common, Camp 020. This is a real camp where enemy prisoners are interrogated. So Araceli is brought there by MI5, blindfolded, and she's told in no uncertain terms how dangerous her actions have been by the fearsome Tin Eye Stevens. Now, when I show you Tin Eye Stevens, who is terrifying, you might realize what poor Araceli has got to face. Tin Eye, because he wears a monocle, is the commander, the real commander of Camp 020. He breaks people down within about half an hour of German prisoners being taken there. He is absolutely amazing. So poor Araceli is battered verbally by this man who tells her how dangerous she's been. And she's in tears. She promises that she hasn't been to the Spanish embassy. And in fact, MI5 have been watching the Spanish embassy, and they know that she didn't go there, even though she threatened to. She didn't go. And she now says in tears, if one is released, she'll help in whatever way she could and will never ask to go back to Spain again. So Garbo's plan, drastic as it is, and it's quite cruel in a way if you think about it, but it did work. It actually stopped Araceli blowing the whole thing apart. Now we're building up to D-Day. D-Day is coming up, and what happens is a high-level committee is set up. It's called the Double Cross or 20 Committee. It's XX, which of course is Roman for 20. So it's either called the Double Cross Committee or the 20 Committee. And they're charged with convincing the Germans that the main landing is going to be in Calais and that the landings in Normandy are just a diversion. This is absolutely crucial to D-Day. They've got to convince the Germans that the Normandy landings are just a feint and that the main landing will come in Calais, which of course is the shortest point across the canal. There are other double agents, quite a number of double agents, and I'm not going to go into detail about them, but Garbo plays the key role. So Garbo and Harris now are told, you've got to convince the Germans what's going on. The Allies even set up a false American army with 12 divisions commanded by General Patton. It's called the 1st US Army Group, FUSAG. There he is. He's a real general. He's not made up. You can see he's a 4-star general. Everybody's heard of him, including the Germans. So this is a brilliant ploy. He's supposed to be in charge of FUSAG. FUSAG does not exist, but the Germans have to believe it exists. So various pieces of information are leaked that Patton is in charge of this fictional group. What we have is an amazing deception plan. They use rubber tanks, blow-up tanks, inflatable tanks are sent to the fields around the south coast. There's hundreds of these things. They have dummy aircraft, they have dummy landing craft, all along the south coast. There's even a lot of false wireless traffic, which the Germans will pick up to convince them that FUSAG is actually getting ready to make the main invasion force in Calais. Now we come to D-Day itself. D-Day is the 6th of June, 1944, and it's Operation Overlord. The Allied troops land on the Normandy beaches. Here's a really good picture that gives you some idea of what it was like. You can see all sorts. You can see the ships out there. The troops have landed. They're coming ashore. all sorts of things are happening. So this is D-Day itself. At this point, Garbo and Harris send a radio message to Madrid about the Normandy landings, but they have to be very carefully timed. As it happens, the Abwehr is the German military intelligence, their radio operator in Madrid has gone home for the evening, and the messages are not read until 8 o'clock the next morning, by which time the Allied troops are firmly ashore. Now, they didn't plan that they would be read the next morning. They wanted them to be read by the Germans just as the landings were taking place, so it would convince them that Garbo's got access to amazing detailed information about D-Day. In fact, what happens, because they're delayed, because the radio operator wasn't there, Garbo sends an incredibly angry message to his German controller, haranguing him. How dare he not have the radio operator there when he sent the most important message he's ever sent is about the landings, and they're not real. It's not the main landing, it's a diversion. So they send further messages, and the Germans then encrypt those and send them on to Berlin, where Hitler himself reads some of these messages, and Hitler calls back the panzer divisions. There's a whole group of crack panzer tank divisions on their way to Normandy to attack the Allies on the beachheads here, and Hitler cancels that and tells them to stay in the Calais area, because that's where the main attack is going to come. So that's crucial in absolutely buying time for the Allies to make a bridgehead and get on across onto the main landing places. And Garbo, in fact, saves a second front. This is a most amazing thing. The deception has totally worked, and the Germans are completely fooled and believe that the main attack will come in Calais. Now we switch a bit, because in June 44, the V1 Doodlebugs start landing in London. So they're coming in and they're crashing. As you know, the engine cuts out and everybody at that point takes cover. They're not very accurately, they're not guided missiles as such. You have to realize they're actually rockets launched from sort of northern France and other bases. And they basically have a little propeller that counts how far they've got. And when that gets to a certain number of revolutions, the engine stops and the thing dives down and explodes. The Germans are really keen to find out how accurately the V1s are landing in London. So they ask Garbo to go and get information about the V1s, to go to the bomb sites and then tell them where they're landing. The MI5 decides to tell the Germans that they're overshooting, so that they'll then reduce the range, and that means some will fall short of London, and that works for a little while, but they realize they can't do this for very long, because foreign agents will be sending more information about where they really land. So they come up with another plan. They tell the Germans that Garbo's been arrested by a policeman for looking at bomb sites in the East End. So it's not a major arrest, but he has been arrested because he's showing too much interest, supposedly. The ploy works. The Germans are terrified that their key aide is going to be arrested for just looking at V1 bomb sites. And so they send him a message saying, stop doing it. We don't want you to do it. So that works as well. So everything's been incredibly successful. The war ends. And at this point, MI5 pays Garbo for his services, using all the money, or some of the money, that the Germans sent for all of the sub-agents. If you remember, there were 20 or 30 agents on that diagram I showed you. The Germans are sending money to pay for them all, and MI5 are just banking it all. It's absolutely amazing that the Germans funded the whole thing. So about half the money is given to Garbo, and he disappears. He just disappears off the map. 5 years later, he dies of malaria in Angola in 1949. So that's kind of the end of the story. To pick up a little bit more, Harris leaves MI5, takes up his painting again and moves to Mallorca. He sells up the Spanish art gallery, moves to Mallorca and does his own painting. Tragically, he dies in a car crash in 1964. Hilda survives the crash, but she dies in 1972 without revealing Garbo's name. So basically, Garbo has disappeared and then died in Angola. Now we come to another phase in the story. This is Nigel West. His real name is Rupert Allison. He was an MP at one point. He's a very good expert on intelligence. He starts to question Garbo's death and he begins a lengthy search to try and find out what happened. In May 1981, he speaks to Anthony Blunt, who's been exposed as a Russian spy 18 months earlier. Blunt is given, basically, he's not quite pardoned, but he's not locked up. It's a bit strange. The British don't quite know what to do with him. So Blunt had been in MI5, and because he was an art expert, if you remember, I don't know if you heard, he was the Queen's art expert. He ran the Queen's Gallery for her. And so he was very involved in art. And of course, through that, he was a close friend of Tommy Harris. So he gives West some information about Garbo. Then Desmond Bristow, who's MI6 and retired, wrote to West and gives him Garbo's full name, Juan Pujol Garcia. West starts to search for people with that name. It's a really difficult search. Twice he finds people with that name. Both of them are dead ends. They're not the right people. Eventually in 1984, he traces a man to Caracas in Venezuela, and he puts in a phone call to this guy. And after a long silence, the man admits he's Garbo, and he was a good friend of Tommy Harris. So there he is. He's living in Caracas, Venezuela. West tells him it's the 40-year anniversary of D-Day. And the Duke of Edinburgh wants to meet Pujol and present him with the MBE that he was awarded in secret in 1944. It's not strictly true because West hasn't spoken to the palace. But what happens is once Garbo agrees to come to London, West contacts the palace and the Duke of Edinburgh says he'd be very happy to present Garbo with his medal. At this point, it's huge publicity. All the newspapers leak the story about West and Garbo and everything. It's really starting to come out. Nigel West and Pujol they're coming to England, but bar America. And they go and meet J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, in his bunker. Apparently, it's a very strange bunker underground where they meet him because Hoover is desperate to meet this famous spy. In London, Nigel West arranges for Pujol to meet some of his old MI5 colleagues. We've actually got a picture with them here. Pujol is the second one from the left, the shortest guy. And the tall guy in there is Mills again. And there's a couple of other, Bristow is, I think, one of them. So the meeting is at the Special Forces Club in May 1984. West has also arranged for Pujol to go to the Normandy beaches. And this is the next slide. Here he is actually on the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June, 40 years after D-Day. And if you look closely at his face, he's not at all happy. He realizes that his work has saved a lot of lives by delaying the German counterattack. Because if you think about it, if the German had brought their troops up, they would have pushed the Allies back into the sea. So he realized it's worked to that extent. But when he goes to the war graves that are all around, thousands of war graves, he bursts into tears and says he had not done enough to prevent all the deaths. It's an absolutely tragic story. He's a bit happier here. Here he is outside the palace with his medal. So he's got the MBE, and it was awarded to him by the Duke of Edinburgh. And this is fascinating. He's the only man to have been awarded the German Iron Cross by Hitler. Hitler authorized that Pujol, because of the quality of the information he was sending about D-Day in particular, he's going to award the Iron Cross and the MBE. Nobody else has ever been awarded both medals. So I think that's really quite amusing. What had happened is that in December 44, the Director General of MI5, Sir David Petrie, had presented Pujol with his MBE in secret. They couldn't allow anyone to know about him. And all that happened is he had a kind of dinner party. So what had happened is Pujol had gone to Venezuela. Tommy Harris had put out all the information that Garbo had died in Angola to protect him. He realized that people would be hunting for him. So he's told everyone that he was dead. In fact, he went to Venezuela, and here we are. What happens is Araceli goes back to Spain with the two boys. They divorce. She and one get a divorce. He marries another woman in Venezuela and has 2 children with her. And Araceli marries a very rich American art dealer in Madrid, and she lives a wonderful life, all the kind of thing that she was longing for when she was cooped up in London. She has a fantastic life in Madrid. Very strange, the two families here, her family and the new family here, did not know of the other's existence. Pujol never told this family anything about his wartime activities. He did not tell them that he was a spy. He did not tell them anything. And only when the whole story broke in 1984 did each of the families realize that the others existed. So it's a strange sort of setup. The end of the story is that 4 years later, Pujol suffers a stroke and he dies in Caracas at the age of 76 on the 15th of October, 1988. And here's his grave, a real grave. This time he did die. This is not a fake. He dies in Caracas, and that, in fact, is the end of the story. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's fascinating. The more I looked at it, the more interesting it became. There's a lot of material on the internet. There are loads of books about him. One book is written by Pujol with an introduction by West, which is a very interesting book. But it's interesting that Pujol doesn't mention Araceli. He literally writes her out of the story. And in fact, she's quite important, as you've seen. There are many other books, and it's a really, really interesting story. There we go. I'll stop there. Malcolm, I think I've got to stop sharing, haven't I? So let me see if I can do that. There we go.
Well, what can I say other than wow? I had heard the story briefly, but I certainly didn't know that detail, nor did I really know how successful he had been. But perhaps there's some questions that people would like to ask. Go ahead, unmute yourself and ask them.
Hi, I have a question, although I think I'm going to have to read the books after hearing that fascinating talk. Could you just please explain again, because I was taking notes, so I think I got behind, what happened with the timing of the D-Day message? I didn't quite get that.
Okay, they sent the radio message and it reached Madrid just as the D-Days, I mean, they'd actually had got ashore. They'd got on the land and they'd got ashore. So they wanted to send the message to convince the Germans that, in fact, Garbo was sending really good information. Mm-hmm. They didn't read the message because the radio operator had gone home, right, and they didn't read it until the next 8 o'clock the next morning. So it went in the evening, but it wasn't received and read. Well, it was received, but not read until 8 o'clock the following morning. Does that help?
No, it was the Hitler part actually.
Ah,
Afterwards.
okay.
I got that part, but what? And Garbo sent an angry message pretending that, you know,
Yeah.
how dare you discount my great information.
Exactly.
But why did Hitler then keep them in Calais? He hadn't received the.
Yeah, okay. Well, the message was sent. The message that was finally accepted at 8 o'clock the next morning was sent by radio to Berlin, and Hitler was talking with his generals about what they should do. They now knew that the Allies had landed in Normandy, and the issue is, shall we send the panzers, which were actually on their way? One of the generals had ordered the panzer divisions to go to Normandy to attack the Allies, and Hitler countermanded the order, saying, no, 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 that's not the main attack. The main attack is going to come later, and it's going to be Calais. So hold the panzer divisions who were just outside in the Calais area in readiness for an attack, of course, which never came. So the delay was there.
That's did Hitler, this is a bit outside of the topic perhaps, but did Hitler have separate information from a spy that Calais would be the besides the
they had lots of information because the deception program, the double cross program, was very effective. It wasn't just sending information from Garbo, it was coming from a whole range of other.
Yeah, thank you.
You have to piece the information together so that they would make a big jigsaw and be convinced that the main attack was going to be Calais.
Okay, thank you so much.
I don't have anything to say.
Right. Any other questions, please?
Yeah, can I ask a question? Which is just, by some extraordinary coincidence, my name's Glasser too. I don't know how that happens. But anyway, we must all be double agents. So presumably at that point, Dick, then his Garbo's cover was definitively blown, was it not? He must have got his Iron Cross before this.
No, the Iron Cross comes just after the D-Day landings. Hitler awards him the Iron Cross just afterwards. So, you know, there's a point between the Allies landing. I've probably got the date actually. Let me see if I can find it when he was given the Iron Cross. Well, he's awarded the Iron Cross on the 28th of July, 1944. So a month and a bit after D-Day, Hitler says, give him an Iron Cross. So that the Iron Cross is 28th of July, 44. He gets his MBE in December 44. So he actually gets the Iron Cross before he gets his MBE.
But why hadn't they twigged that the Calais thing didn't happen? The Calais thing obviously didn't happen. So therefore the information he'd been sending was misleading.
Yeah, but he's very clever. They then relay more information and in fact say, yes, there isn't going to be an attack, the main attack. Once it's too late for them to do anything, they do send other messages convincing the Germans that in fact the Normandy landings are the main landings. So they only send those messages once they've convinced the Germans to hold things up a little bit in Calais. So his cover isn't blown. In fact, after the war, I didn't say any of this, after the war, he actually goes back to Madrid and meets his German controller, who thinks he's been brilliant. They're absolutely over the moon with the quality of information that Garbo's been sending them. So his cover is never blown, ever.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Right. Are there any more questions, anyone? I think we're all probably a bit stunned by the sheer information and the success of his achievements. But that's a wonderful story, and thank you so much for carrying it out and presenting it so well, and producing a local connection for us as well. I mean, he was not living that far away from Camden's boundaries, as well as his handler living within it. So, yes.
Thanks, Malcolm. Yes, the Camden link is fairly minor. He was born there and lived there for quite a while. And then when the family, as I say, get really wealthy with their art dealing, they move into that fabulous house in Mayfair. I just love the idea that it's an open house for all these young MI5 and MI6 people. They're all there having a wonderful time. And in fact, all the spies are meeting up there. It's very strange, actually, how the sort of Cambridge group of spies interlink with this story.
Can I ask a question? What did he get up to in Venezuela all those years?
Oh, yeah. He tries all sorts of things and they all fail. He's a terrible businessman. In fact, at one point, Tommy Harris even tries to send him Spanish paintings that he could sell in South America. So he's trying to make a bit of money out of art. And again, Tommy is astonishing. I mean, the friendship between the two of them was quite amazing. So he tries to help him. He seems to send him money. Somebody leaked a story, I think it was Malcolm Muggeridge, was very mischievous and actually says, oh, they were fake paintings. They were dealing in faked Spanish paintings. But again, none of this is ever proved. And there are all sorts of rumors, but he's not really successful. He's only really successful when he's in this incredibly creative mood, sitting in that little office, inventing stories. I mean, you have to start looking in detail at these stories and the messages that he sent. I had to cut those out. I couldn't give those to you. It would take me too long. There are every single one of those agents had got a detailed biography, really detailed. And they lived these stories. So they're sitting in this tiny little office, bouncing ideas backwards and forwards between Tommy Harris and Pujol, and they're both creating an incredible fiction. I mean, it's the most amazing fiction. Some of the books have got loads of stuff about each of the spies, each of the non-existent spies, of course. None of them existed. Actually, one of them existed. One of them is Cyril Miles. He goes off to Canada, but he becomes spy number 5 and keeps sending messages from Canada that they relay on to the Germans. So he's the only real one there.
And you said that Araceli had a wonderful life in Madrid.
Yes.
If that was possible in Franco's time.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
what?
Oh, you're right. This is after the war. She's with a phenomenally rich art dealer. She married and I think had children with him. And he moves in very high circles, real high society circles, which is what she wanted. She loves dressing up. She loves partying. I mean, you could see from the photograph of her, she's an incredibly vivacious, glamorous woman. And she was just kept under wraps in Hendon. I mean, you can imagine this poor woman stuck in Hendon, of all places, not allowed to go anywhere.
Right. Oh, Jerry, can you unmute yourself, Jerry? Jerry, can you unmute yourself? Jerry,
yeah.
If you want to oh, that's right. No.
Sorry, beg your pardon. That was fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, Dick. I really enjoyed that. Garbo Pujol must have had a sort of charisma about him, because this fantasy network that he had built up surely could have been double checked by Nazi agents, or back in Germany, even by looking at births, marriages, and deaths, and all that sort of thing. They must have been just completely captivated by their spy, that they thought, well, what he's sending us is so true, we're not going to bother. But just one little revelation could have emptied the whole bag full of fantasy.
Yeah, it's a good point, Jerry. You're right. There is a point where an agent, not in Britain, I think he's in, I've forgotten where he is, but an agent who is being captured by the Germans, MI5 are desperate that he doesn't tell the Germans what's going on, because he does have some information. The MI5 and MI6, well, MI5 particularly seemed very good at capturing most German agents that were sent in and turning them. There are very few that we know of that were successfully working in Britain. Most of the ones that came over were caught fairly quickly and were told, well, you're going to the tower, you're going to be shot, or you can work for us. And not surprisingly, most of them turned. So there weren't, as far as we know, there weren't that many active agents working here, but there were agents working elsewhere in Europe that did have some information that could have blown the whole story. But the guy who was captured never told. He went to the concentration camps and never revealed any information. So the story was never blown, ever.
He was a lucky man.
Very, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Gary.
Thank you.
Right, are there any more?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk, beautifully told, if I may say. But can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
So the first question is, was he ever awarded British citizenship? Because I find it interesting he was made an NBE, yet was Spanish. Do you know?
As far as I know, Andy, as far as I know, he was not given British citizenship. So, as I say, he probably didn't want it in a sense. He basically wanted to disappear. He's a very unusual man. When you meet him, apparently, he's quite quiet. He's a very small man. He's charming. He was a very good dancer, which is probably how he met Araceli. I think they had a dancing partnership. But he didn't want British citizenship. He just wanted to disappear. But he couldn't. He and Araceli had got to such an awful point that when the war, as soon as VE Day was announced in London, she basically was off. She went back to Spain. Then she did go to South America with him for a little while, but the relationship just disintegrated, and she took the two boys and went home to Spain, where, as I said, she divorced and then remarried. Pujol just basically wanted to disappear. He was offered a job, I think, with an oil company. The British did offer him a job with an oil company in South America, but he was no good. He was really terrible at office work and business work. He's just a dreamer. I mean, if you're old enough, and my dad told me about this, he loved Tom Mix. Tom Mix was an American early cowboy. And all these early films of Tom Mix, my dad grew up in Vienna and loved them. And Pujol in Spain loved all the Tom Mix stories as well. He's always into these fantasies and these dreams. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be in his dream world, but he had to make a living, and he was terrible at it. So he didn't want British citizenship ever, as far as we can tell.
Do you know how he actually got to Venezuela? He ended up in Paris, given, one could make parallel connections or comparisons to the rat line where so many German Nazis ended up going more to Argentina than to Venezuela, which
that's a good point. You're right. Yeah,
one of the German connections to end up in Venezuela, which would have been the ultimate double bluff in some ways.
Well, the interesting thing is, when the war finished, MI5 did have a plan to try and infiltrate the Russians, which would be interesting, wouldn't it? Because they had the Cambridge group of Russians Russian spies who all knew Garbo. So I don't think he would have been very successful trying to infiltrate the Russians, but he didn't want to do it anyway. He just wanted to take the money. It was quite a substantial sum. And he basically just goes to South America, presumably where he can speak. Is Venezuela a Spanish speaking? I think it is. I think it's Spanish speaking, yeah. So he went there and tried to set up, as I say, he tried all sorts of ventures. None of them worked. So I don't think it's a German connection. I'm saying it's not the German Nazi connection to South America, as far as I know.
Yeah, okay. And do you know what happened to his family in Venezuela?
No, I think they're still there. I mean, you can see the boys were quite young. As far as I know, they're still there.
Well, thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Okay.
Harvey, if you could mute yourself, yeah, if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Two things. I get the impression that the Germany was regarded as very efficient and still is very efficient. But I get the impression the German spy network could be regarded as not being very efficient, to say the least. And the second point I'd like to say is that regarding Hitler started the Second World War, in my opinion, but also with his inefficiency, he helped finish it. They're the comments I like to make.
Yeah, good points. You're right. The Germans, remember, the Germans were operating from Madrid. I mean, that's the key. It was in Madrid that Garbo's handler worked. And he just basically conned him totally. He absolutely conned him. But then those messages went up the line so that the German generals and even Hitler himself was also conned into believing that these were accurate information. I have to tell you, I missed a bit out. When Pujol was in Lisbon, sending the fake messages to the Germans, and the British were picking them up, they were very confused because he sent some of the things which were his expenses, but he didn't understand pounds, shillings, and pence. And he was sending information about, he'd had a railway journey from Liverpool to London, and it was 4 shillings and 6pence or something. And it was completely wrong. He also put in messages about how the Liverpool, the working class Liverpool people love having a litre of wine with their fish and chips. He got so many things wrong, because if you think about it, he didn't know anything. He's sitting in Lisbon trying to read guidebooks about London and England, and he's making things up. So he made so many errors. The MI5 and MI6 thought he was a terrible spy at first, and it was only that Malta convoy, the fake Malta convoy, that really convinced them how good he was. Because why would the Germans send all these submarines for a non-existent convoy? So that's what was the trigger. And then they worked out who he was, and then they got him back to England. And of course, working with MI5, he had much better information to send to the Germans. So it was really convincing at that point.
Right. Well, if there's not any more questions, can I really thank you again for an absorbing talk this evening? And one's mouth really falls open at what he succeeded in doing. Yeah, it was amazing. So, Dick, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a really wonderful evening.
Thanks.